This is Peter Coleman. I am a faculty member at Columbia University who studies peace and conflict. I'm a social psychologist by training, and I direct a center, a teachers college in conflict and peace, and I'm on faculty at the Earth Institute. And tonight I have the pleasure of interviewing a colleague and a doctoral student that I work with here at Columbia who has a very unique background. Her name is Webb, and she has a background in primatology and so studies chimps and primates, and has worked with the likes of Frans de Waal, who is a renowned primatologist, but has come to Columbia and is studying in psychology and studying the psychology of reconciliation and conflict resolution. And so we've had the pleasure of working together for a couple of years now. So I've asked Christine to come and speak a little bit about her work and about how she got into the study of conflict resolution in the first place and how she got from chimps to humans and a little bit of that. So Christine, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for being here. So give us a little background. How did you get into the study of conflict, and was it through chimps or was it through something else?
Okay, so I still remember actually one of the first primate social psychology classes that I had with de Waal, who is this primatologist who's been studying conflict and post-conflict behavior in chimpanzees for many years. And one of the first images he put up on the board was of these two chimpanzees in separate trees, and they were holding their hands out to one another in this sort of ostensibly friendly gesture. And he said that these chimpanzees had just been into a fight, and they went into separate trees. And just after he captured this photograph, they came together in some kind of friendly reunion. And I remember thinking, wow, isn't that cool? You know, it's kind of like human behavior. And so that kind of stuck in my mind. And then when we learned about examples of chimpanzee or other primate conflict and reconciliation, it definitely stuck in my mind. And then when I came to Columbia, the advisor with whom I began working was doing some work on forgiveness, post-conflict behavior, and interpersonal close relationships. And so then I started thinking about how I could blend the two together.
So Frans de Waal, does he do research in the bush, in the field? Does he work in enclosed labs or in a zoo? Where does he work? How does he work?
So he's at Emory University, which is affiliated with the Yerkes National Primate Research Center. And at Yerkes, it's a field station, actually just outside of Atlanta, where two groups of captive chimpanzees live in these indoor, sort of outdoor enclosures. So it kind of could look like a zoo. And that's where a lot of his research on reconciliation behavior has been done. But prior to that, it was at a zoo in the Netherlands, where he's from, in an even larger enclosure.
So Frans de Waal has written a book on conflict resolution amongst primates. I can't remember the title of it, but in it he proposes a kind of provocative theory that in fact the closer chimps are in relationship, the more likely they are to have conflict because their relationship can withstand that, and that the more alienated they are from each other, the less likely they are. And that's, not how we think about it as humans.
Yeah, exactly. I think the book you're thinking of is Chimpanzee Politics, and there's also Natural Conflict Resolution, which he edited. And yeah, so the whole idea is this, it's called the valuable relationships hypothesis, and it's that animals will tend to preferentially direct their affiliative behaviors towards opponents post-conflict, but also towards those individuals with whom they have a close relationship. So kin, closely related individuals, or strongly allied individuals, like in chimpanzees, males tend to form alliances with one another. So you see a lot of reconciliations there. But curiously, those are also the relationships that are characterized by the most conflict.
Sure.
And in some ways, I think we do see similar things in humans, because I fight probably the most with my family or my close friends.
Sure.
Yet at the same time, those are the relationships that are the most worth preserving.
Right. So does de Waal make the link from primate behavior and reconciliation processes to humans, or is that your link?
So he does. I think in what he taught me and what his big message in a lot of his books really is that, at our core, this kind of previous notion of humans as naturally aggressive, like demonic creatures who
territorial,
exactly,
right.
who are motivated for conflict and competition is not the right story. That at our core we are a cooperative and altruistic and then reconciliatory species. So I think that's sort of how he tells that evolutionary story.
So how did you get from his lab and that research to wanting to study psychology?
So I was a psychology major as an undergraduate. Franz is actually in the psychology department at Emory, and so as an undergraduate, I was able to focus a lot of my work in animal behavior while still getting the training in psychology. So actually, when it came to applying to graduate schools, I was probably a better suited candidate for a psychology program. And I, was familiar with some of the work on non-human primates that was done at Columbia, but ended up being drawn to Tori Higgins' Human Motivation Lab because I just saw it as a really cool way of studying some of the underlying motivations for these phenomena.
So tell us a little bit about so you've come to Columbia now. You've been here 3 years,
4 years.
4 years now. Okay, and so you're now working in the area of reconciliation, but still working with primates, right? So
Yeah.
you go back and forth between studying human behavior and primate behavior.
Yes, so I have an ongoing collaboration with Franz de Waal.
Right.
I'm looking at a data set that was collected over 9 years on chimpanzee conflict and post-conflict behavior. And then with Tori Higgins, I'm studying human participants' motivations for resolving social conflicts.
So what are some of the research questions? What are some of the studies that you do here on humans that would link to chimps?
So one of the things that I've become recently interested in is this idea of individual differences. And so with humans, a lot of what I was researching was revealing that people have different motivations for resolving conflicts. And after a conflict of interest between two friends, for example, sometimes people seem very motivated to just move on, to move forward from the conflict as quickly and as efficiently as possible, whereas others seem to want to dwell a bit more, dig a little bit deeper to really get at the heart of the matter. And so I started looking at this in the context of, human self-regulation and what people are motivated to do. And it's led me to some really interesting questions in the chimpanzees. So in the chimpanzees, what happens post-conflict? Are they motivated to approach another partner right away? Do they take a little bit more time? Do they tend to avoid? And a variety of other questions that kind of stem from this underlying motivational principle.
So either of those approaches, whether you wanted to, so you have a conflict with someone, and your roommate or your girlfriend or boyfriend, and you could be motivated just to get through it, get it over with, resolve it as quickly as possible, and that could be kind of pathological, that you just can't stand it, or it could be constructive. Let's just move on, right?
Yes.
Similarly, with the rumination, you could ruminate pathologically on a conflict that happened that could be resolved.
Yes.
Or you could want to think more deeply about it to understand, why did you do certain things? What's going on with this relationship? Something like that. So they can take either course, right? They can. There isn't a good strategy and a bad strategy.
Exactly, and often what we find when it comes to these self-regulatory systems is that there is a combination of both that is necessary for successful conflict resolution. And so seeing that there were these individual differences.
So you mean both to want to move on, but also get somewhat deeply into it.
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
To move forward, but also move in the right direction. And so this idea that there are just these individual differences in basic motivations allowed me to look at the chimpanzee data a little bit differently, not necessarily looking for these same self-regulation systems of moving on or rumination, but just that at the very core, some animals might be more motivated to resolve and some animals may be less so. And what are some correlates of those individual differences that could shed light on, the evolution of this phenomenon in general?
So correlates. So do you look at like personality differences in humans and or in chimps?
Yes, so
Yeah.
you could look at personality differences and then other just random variables like who initiated the reconciliation. So are individuals who reconcile more likely to initiate the reconciliations that follow? It seems intuitive that that would be the case, but within chimpanzees, say you reconcile a lot.
Right.
So a very high proportion of conflicts that you have with other individuals are reconciled.
Right.
Does that mean that you are reconciling those conflicts, or that you might just be the alpha male and all these other individuals are initiating reconciliations with you?
Sure.
So it's sort of looking at these basic processes within an individual that are going on to help us understand motivations for conflict resolution.
So my guest is Christine Webb, who is a PhD student in psychology at Columbia, who studies both with Friends to Waal, studies primate reconciliation processes, and at Columbia with Tori Higgins, and in our lab at the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, studies human conflict dynamics and forgiveness and reconciliation dynamics. So your approach could be characterized as an evolutionary approach, right?
Yes, I believe.
So, and that's somewhat rare in psychology, that people think in evolutionary terms. Probably less rare in primatology. But so how does thinking about reconciliation processes from an evolutionary perspective, how does that work and how does that help?
So I think it gives us a sense for human nature a bit more. It kind of, the way I picture it is you zoom out and you take a look at human behavior from a very basic perspective, and you say, what are some of the basic motives and drivers of our behavior? At the end of the day, I think what it really does is it inspires new and interesting questions. So it's just another way, it's another lens, another perspective looking at things to try and understand why we behave the way that we do.
So, but does it back up into, so some evolutionary psychology backs up into the basics of survival or procreation, right? That I want my genes just to live on, right? And that those are the sort of fundamental drivers of some behavior. Do you back up that far in thinking about reconciliation processes and how it connects to that?
In a way, in terms of the valuable relationships hypothesis that I referred to earlier, which is that primates, humans alike, tend to resolve conflicts with valued social partners. One of the mechanisms or functions of that is to preserve high-quality social relationships, which are the relationships that are likely to give you more resources, like support in fights or food or mating opportunities. And so you're preserving those relationships in order to have access to those resources yourself. So in a way, it does go back that far. Although I don't think that as a person who is, I guess, more of an evolutionary psychologist than an evolutionary biologist, I tend to focus more on these other, not on that far back of what's happening.
I see. So you see it as context, and it could be logically linked to the motives that you're more focused on.
Yes,
right,
exactly.
Yeah. So tell us. So you were talking a little bit about Tori Higgins' work and some of his theories of motivation and how that's informed this work. And you talk about, I guess it's this idea of locomotion, people wanting to move through things versus people that sort of sit with things. So how do you see, what difference does that make in a conflict?
Okay, so thinking about, in humans or in chimpanzees?
Well, why don't we start with chimps and move to humans?
Okay, so let's think about locomotion, I guess, at first, because I think when it comes to the chimpanzee research, I'm really focusing my efforts right now not on this cognitive piece of assessment, which is the aspect of trying to figure out what went wrong, but just on this idea of locomotion, of what animals do post-conflict. Are they motivated to reconcile? Do they move on? Are they moving forward? And so the way that you can look at that in chimpanzees is just by looking at how active are these individuals within their social groups. Ideally, we could look at behavioral indices, how active they are during the day. We have some, work in locomotion that shows us that humans who are higher in locomotion tend to be more active, right?
So physically active.
Physically
like
active. It doesn't just have to be related to conflict. It can be, at a very basic level. And so looking at chimpanzees and seeing, how socially active are they in a group? How often do they switch their social behaviors or their behaviors in general? We also look at latencies a lot. So how fast do animals react to certain stimuli? So how quick are they to initiate a certain type of behavior? How quick are they to approach another animal post-conflict? And a variety of other variables that serve as proxies for understanding locomotion. Now, I don't think that locomotion in chimpanzees looks how it does in humans necessarily, but the point is that it's sort of inspired a new way of viewing these data.
Lens,
yeah, definitely.
Right. So, and you said earlier that what you're thinking, at least at this point, is that some kind of optimal combination of both. That in a conflict, you will probably be better off to want some combination of let's get this over with and get on with things, and some delving into it and reflecting on it.
Yeah.
Have you seen that yet in research? Have you been able to study that sort of optimal combination yet at all?
Not the optimal combination part. That is definitely something that, I'm looking to do next. Although I will say on a more anecdotal level, in the chimpanzees, for example, after you've had a bout of aggression with another individual, there's two choices. You can approach that individual and try to reconcile, or you cannot. And if you're too quick to do that, sometimes you risk attack. So some assessment, quote unquote, should be involved in that process because, and this is getting back to that basic kind of biological analysis of what's going on, but what are the cost and benefits of reconciliation in this case, or of attempting reconciliation? The cost is I risk renewed attack. The benefit would be I am opening the door for continued relationship. So, and I think, the same kind of process plays out in humans. You need to pick your battles in the first place. And then I also kind of think you need to pick your routes for reconciliation. You need to pick the correct strategies in order for it to be successful and the right timing, right?
Sure, right. And reconciliation processes help you build allegiances, allies for future, for other kinds of problems and stronger relationships. And so there's benefits from both perspectives. So, so are you circling into your dissertation research yet at this point? And what are the kinds of questions that you would look at? And will your research continue to go back and forth between humans and primates, or will you take a direction?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question first, because I hope that I continue to do work with both humans and chimpanzees. For the most part, because I've found them to be very, I guess that sort of cross-section to be very rewarding, and it inspires lots of interesting questions. And so now, just
to be clear about that, so because there is criticism, right, amongst people who study primates, that it's not generalizable to human beings, that human beings have different kinds of cognitive functions and values and abstract thinking and things that we don't think primates have, or at least to the degree that we have, and so generalizing from one population to the next is problematic, they would argue. But that's not what you're suggesting, right?
Exactly. So I'm not trying to make that leap, at least at this stage in my career. I think my focus is on the questions that this interdisciplinary approach generates, and I think that there are questions that I would have never thought of, to look for in the chimpanzees, and there's questions that I've come up with in the chimpanzees that by looking at that data that I would have never thought to investigate in humans. So it's all a matter of trying to
use
just
a different lens.
Get new ideas, and that is definitely going to be the focus for my dissertation is outlining what I think these interesting perspectives are, and then several projects. So one in particular, a recent project that I think could probably unfold into my dissertation work, depending on how it goes, but I'd like for it to be a part of it, are these social network analyses. So it's something that we have the data set in chimpanzees. This allows us to look at social networks because it's two groups of chimps The data was collected over 9 years, and we have data on affiliation patterns, not just conflicts.
When you say two groups, are they two groups in the same space, or are they in different spaces?
Separately housed, yeah.
Okay.
But we have tons of data on their social behaviors and on conflict and post-conflict behaviors. And similarly in humans, we can collect these measures, just, how affiliative, what are your affiliative networks? What are your conflict networks? What are your reconciliation networks? And then my questions would be things at the level of the individual. So, how does your position within a social network influence how likely you are to be a high reconciler? Is it those individuals who are very central to a social network, which would seem to make sense, but often there's individuals on the periphery of certain social networks, or peripheral individuals who connect, one group to another group that tend to have very high rates of reconciliation. So
they're facilitators, you mean?
In a way, yeah. And so we can kind of study this in both, humans and in other primates. And then that's at the level of the individual. But then at the level of the group, there's other interesting questions. So you can look at certain network structures, so dense networks, which are kind of all individuals interact with the same other individuals consistently.
And have strong relationships.
And have strong
and
bonds.
Right.
Versus more diffuse networks, which are, probably individuals interacting with more different partners, looser ties, and seeing, what types of groups are reconciliations most common in. Intuitively, we might think that dense networks would involve a lot more reconciliation because these are valuable relationships, these are close partners. But what if those networks are already so dense to the point where you don't really need reconciliation to resolve conflict because those networks aren't going anywhere, And so what if in these more diffuse networks, maybe even networks that were more recently formed, you can think of it in a lot of different ways, might reconciliations be a more important tool for preserving social cohesion?
Sure, and it might be just that in more dense communities where you have very strong ties, conflicts that happen within those communities mean a very different thing than people, communities that are loosely connected and they have relationships that aren't as important.
Yes.
Because conflict then might be, an irritant, but not that meaningful. But if it's with your family or your, strong kin, it resonates much more. And those of us that have siblings know what I'm talking about. Right?
Exactly.
So it could be that they're very different animals. What I think about is interesting in your work and in de Waal's work is that a lot of conflict research that's done is done either on people, on one-to-one, how I think about conflict and approach it, or maybe in a dyad, so two people are negotiating, and it does feel like de Waal put that in the context of relationships, which is just beyond a one-time negotiation. It's an ongoing set of dynamics between two or more people, and now moving into communities and systems and these broader networks. And I think that's so important because it's rare that any kind of conflict happens just between two people and nobody else is involved, nobody else is observing, nobody else has influenced it. But it seems like this approach really lends itself to thinking about conflict dynamics and reconciliation dynamics more broadly in that more systemic way.
Yeah, certainly. Another line of de Waal's research, and there's a lot of other primatologists who have focused on not only reconciliation but on conciliation behaviors. So this is sort of involving what you're talking about, because conciliation would be a third party intervening into the post-conflict interaction.
And they see that in chimps as well.
Yeah, so it's sort of this interesting
like a mediator, or
in a way,
right.
It's a third. Often, you might find that it's like these younger individuals within a group, because they're not risking attack if they approach a member of the dyad that got into a fight afterwards, and they might start engaging in these peaceful post-conflict behaviors with the opponents, or with one of the opponents. Maybe it's the victim, maybe it's the aggressor, and sort of serving as this mediator in a way.
Mitigator, so to reduce the conflict.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think conciliation actually is defined as like third-party mediation, and that involves a very high level mental, complexity, I think,
Sure.
going on there that a lot of people would be surprised to hear exists in chimpanzees.
Sure. Very interesting. How are we on time?
We should probably wrap up, guys.
Okay. All right. So we'll close, but is there anything else that you wanted to share about your research or about your approach that you think is, again, unique or provocative, or we'll get the phone ringing?
Well, I do think, kind of back to one of your earlier questions about the value of this evolutionary approach.
Yeah.
I think one of the most, or what people say, one of the most important things about conflict resolution, like that first step, is getting people to listen.
Yeah.
And what I've found, over the last 4 years and even before that, is that people are really curious about this evolutionary approach. It's like this inherent interest of humans to understand human nature, and to understand how the human mind and human behavior evolved. So I think you're almost guaranteed to get people to listen when you talk about the evolutionary origins of conflict resolution. And so we're kind of set there.
Great.
And so in addition to it inspiring, interesting questions, I definitely think it's a way to get people interested and to engage, parties sitting at a negotiation table trying to resolve conflict. It cannot hurt to bring this perspective to
Capture attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your fascinating work, and we'll be eager to hear how things evolve.
Thank you for
Okay.
having me.
Okay, thanks much.